Hey everybody. Hey. Welcome back to another ESAS. Yeah, I'm not unavailable this time, but I am somewhat ill at the moment. So if you hear sniffling and coughing, this is me getting through a sickness. So yes, but I figured it was fitting that Bloodborne is full of sickness and may as well watch it while also sick. So fuck it. Yeah, so I just wanted to get back into this because we're getting there. We're about half an hour from Bergenworth, which is where ROM is, which I know is going to be a big part of watching this because I know a lot of people have a lot to say about ROM, and I'm one of those people. So let's continue on here. I have no idea what we were talking about beforehand, but let's try to continue and get through this video because holy shit, I want to move on to something else, and this is taking forever. But let's see how it goes.
Is and how it relates to the Nightmare Frontier is anyone's guess, but considering that the Yharnam Stone seems to be the fossilized remains of Queen Yharnam's stillborn son Murgo, likely the Tonsil Stone is something depressing. Also, don't go image searching for tonsil stones. Those things are disgusting.
To understand the Nightmare Frontier, we first need to understand the Chalice dungeons and what I've talked a bit about with the cycle of the Old Blood. That is, what is happening in Yharnam right now has happened before in this universe. The E's root chalice reads, root chalice that breaks multiple labyrinth seals. Root chalices, used in rituals to break old labyrinth seals, are said to change the labyrinth's form each time. According to the choir, the land of Ease lies in contact with the cosmos, which allowed the Great Ones to function on transcendental planes of thought. And
Yeah,
the Ailing Loran chalice reads, a chalice that breaks a labyrinth seal. Loran is a tragic land that was devoured by the sands. The tragedy that struck this ailing land of Loran is said to have its root in the scourge of the beast. Some have made the dreaded extrapolation that Yharnam will be next. Yharnam is either going to destroy itself, or it will manage to transcend like East did and manage to give birth to a new Great Ones. And although this game isn't very in your face about it, these games thrive on subdued and subtle storytelling, the idea is that the Nightmare of Mensis, which is the same as the Nightmare Frontier, is Loran. Just like how the Hunter's Nightmare is Yharnam. It's a dream memory of a place and probably was born from a Great One, much like how the Hunter's Nightmare was born when Kaz placed a curse on the Hunters.
If we imagine that this area was still the entrance to the Nightmare of Mensis, it would even explain why Mikalash is beckoning Kaz in the Nightmare, considering Kaz was probably born in Loran. The crawlers, the white aquatic-looking giant slug monsters in this area, are eerily similar to Kaz's corpse, which we'll find on the beach of the fishing hamlet in a few hours, what with their wide aquatic exterior. And the crawlers' bellies are also littered with messengers, like how Kaz was pregnant. And there's also to consider that the dreamlands in Bloodborne all seem to be born of a Great One. The Hunter's Dream was made by the Moon Presence, the Hunter's Nightmare was born of the Curse of Kaz, and the Nightmare Frontier's origin, what caused it to be made, it's not really elaborated on, but considering that Loran is said to have fallen and have been filled with beasts, and that this area is littered to the brim and more with tombstones, the mind does not need to linger far for possible answers. Moving away from the canon of this game, the Nightmare Frontier is pretty much just the Dreamland in Lovecraft's The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, what with its multitudes of basalt columns and beasts with sideways mouths. I'm no Bloodborne expert, but I take pride in my performance against the amygdala here. On my test prior to recording, I was 20 levels higher than I am in the recording now, and my weapon was more upgraded in that run as well. The amygdala fight might be the best embodiment of what the alterations Bloodborne made to the combat can do for the boss battles. If I had to note the main difference between boss battles in Souls and boss battles in Bloodborne, it's that Bloodborne enables players to actively strike at the boss's weak points rather than just having players wait for the boss to exhaust their animations.
Okay, now we can actually get into some criticisms here. Okay, he's actually talked about mechanical stuff instead of going, lore is interesting, listen to this. All right, let's go back to what he said about this. Because now that he's actually talking about a boss that mechanically we can talk about, I have a feeling he's going to try to make Bloodborne seem more unique in the way that you hit weak parts of enemies, which is technically something Bloodborne does excel at, but it's not the first appearance of it.
Boss battles in Souls and boss battles in Bloodborne, it's that Bloodborne enables players to actively strike at the boss's weak points rather than just having players wait for the boss to exhaust their animations. There are, of course, weapons more suited for each boss. Ludwig's Holy Blade and the Burial Blade are pretty much cheating when it comes to the amygdala, but each weapon excels at its own niche, and there's probably a boss for every weapon. Another massive shakeup is that because the player is not locked down by stamina regeneration concerns as it relates to armor weight, bosses can now be optimized without concerns for slow players needing to be able to defeat them. And because players now have a higher threshold for their ability to maneuver through the arena, bosses can be designed to take advantage of a larger, more complex range, since players can respond to that. Here, that's seen in the amygdala's multiple arms being able to attack from different points of origins, without the player ever really being unable to pay attention.
Hold on a minute, what was that last part?
Amygdala's multiple arms being able to attack from different points of origins, without the player ever really being unable to pay attention.
Without the player being unable to pay attention. You mean the boss that has multiple limbs that flails around a lot has limbs that are easy to keep track of? I'm a press X to doubt. Just real quick, I'm pressing that X. I need to get like a little X button that lets you put custom sound effects on it. That'd be fun. But like, if what I understand he's saying is correct, he's saying that it's easy to keep track of all the limbs in these monsters, which is something that I would say is the biggest problem with Bloodborne, and that it's hard to keep track of bosses sometimes just because of how flaily and spazzy they are. Not to mention when you have that comboed with the camera fuckery of this series on top of massive bosses like this. Oh, let me back up and get that full context again just to make sure I understand his point right, because it sounds iffy.
Here, that's seen in the amygdala's multiple arms being able to attack from different points of origins, without the player ever really being unable to pay attention.
Ever really being unable to pay attention? Such a weird way to word it. Such a strange way to like. It's just weird. It's just a weird way to phrase that.
The only place they won't see the strikes coming from is from underneath the thing, and when players get there, the amygdala likes to jump on top of the player. Once you get the timing right, the amygdala's jump is really good for recovering a bit from the hectic fight, but for first-timers, this is almost certainly an insta-death trap, pushing them to engage the boss from further away. Now,
which I gotta ask, how are you gonna engage the boss from further away when he's got extremely flaily attacks in melee range, and you hardly have any ranged attacks besides items and a gun that does pitiful damage, unless you're doing the info run where you have an auto cannon. I'm struggling to find how he expects you to do this, because it seems like he's essentially doing what he said is one of the bigger parts of the game, which is just smack the weak point and exploit it. And that's kind of what he's doing here with the amygdala, and I'm wondering if he's aware of the point he's making and how it sort of contrasts with the simplicity of finding an exploit and using it. Like, I wonder how he justifies like a couple of different things in that sort of argument together.
a bit from the hectic fight, but for first-timers, this is almost certainly an insta-death trap, pushing them to engage the boss from further away. Not that the player has some major advantage from close-up. The damage this boss takes from strikes near its crotch is negligible. There's a small window which can deal decent damage, but even so, the player is supposed to attack the hands and the head. And my now famous overhead vertical swing is just a tool for the job. That, and as I already said, the burial blade. With just a few precise strikes, I'm able to open the amygdala up to visceral attacks, and I try to capitalize on those as much as I can. Not so much because of the damage those deal, but rather because the time it takes for the amygdala to get back into the fight is time I'm getting free stamina and some heals in, if I need them. The best bosses in these games have a sort of ebb and flow. It's rare for a boss, which is a total pushover, to be a favorite, and I think it's equally rare for an endlessly aggressive maniac to crack top 10 lists.
I mean, that point I think is a fair point to make about it, but on the one hand, there are bosses that are more aggressive than others and are significantly more aggressive while still having openings, right? Like having proper openings doesn't mean the boss is not aggressive, right? And I hope he qualifies what he just said, because that's and you can kind of take in different directions in terms of bosses that are pushovers versus bosses that are more aggressive than others, but still have the same level of openings in terms of the openings are fair and they're not, 10 minutes apart.
Or a boss, which is a total pushover, to be a favorite, and I think it's equally rare for an endlessly aggressive maniac to crack top 10 lists. Maiden Estrella and Ludwig prove that it can happen, but I think it's rarer than people maybe think it is. The amygdala was one of this game's best, and I think many of people's favorite bosses in this game all have in common that they lean on the strengths of this combat system rather than being carryovers design-wise from Dark Souls.
Hold on. Hold on just a minute.
Was one of this game's best, and I think it is. The amygdala was one of this game's best, and I think
the amygdala was one of this game's best, referring to bosses. You mean the thing that kind of spazzes around, has a lot of really, really janky attacks that just flow all over the place while you're trying to A, stay away from it, or B, trying to hit its one weak point in its head? Like, while I think the amygdala is not necessarily a terrible boss fight, I do think that there are some things about it that, kind of keep it from being a good boss fight in terms of like a better than average Souls fight. And one thing that I've always believed is that every good Souls fight is a dance, back and forth between you and the boss, where you're kind of doing things back and forth in terms of just who's attacking, who's defending, and who's kind of avoiding you. That's one reason why Artorias is a really good example of a good one-on-one fight. Just because Artorias has a good moveset that's aggressive but punishable. And it's aggressive and punishable in different ways to different builds at different points in the fight, right? But you also have it where he will dodge, like he also dodges. So it's like a thing where, you need to get your attack in at the right time. The boss isn't just open and waiting for you to smack him around. But let's get back to what he's going to say about the amygdala, because it's one of those things where he's making it sound like this combat system is helping with the amygdala fight, when it helps with all the boss fights in this game, just because you have visceral attacks that you don't typically have in bosses before this. Now obviously bosses in previous games could be parried, right? And they had, points where you could punish them, like one that I would cite would be the Iron Golem. You smack the crap out of his legs, you do enough damage, enough poise damage to him, you knock him over, and then you can smack him while he's on the ground. Similar to the Tower Knight fight as well from Demon Souls, right? So having an enemy with weaknesses that you can exploit for critical damage is not necessarily something Bloodborne invented, or even really anything new. right? Like other bosses have done this. I mean, Dark Souls 2, you could even count. I know that this was produced in the same sort of time frame as Dark Souls 2, but in terms of release, Dark Souls 2 did come out before this. In the Undead Chariot does have it where you can abuse the boss. You can get its health down so that when it makes a jump, it'll get stuck on the edge, and then you can run up and smack it and then kill it. Granted, that's not the most engaging way to fight the boss, but at least in my opinion. But just there are some things in the things that he says often in this video which shows that he's either sort of gone through the games maybe once or twice beforehand, or he's just completely forgetting about things that have existed before. And again, some of this might be just he needs to word things a little bit better, because there are a lot of things that he seems to be claiming are great aspects of Bloodborne that Bloodborne invented when Bloodborne did not invent them. And that's a running issue I've found throughout this video, is that he will give credit to Bloodborne when credit belongs to a game that came out previously.
Many of people's favorite bosses in this game all have in common that they lean on the strengths of this combat system rather than being carryovers design-wise from Dark Souls.
And that's one point too, is like, it's about the combat system that are not carryovers from Dark Souls. A lot of things about this combat system are carryovers from Dark Souls, in that the most basic functionality of combat is largely the same. You have a dodge that you must do to avoid damage as much as possible. You have to hit the enemy with a melee attack of some sort, right? Like it's some of the most basic shit from Dark Souls. Now, things do get shaken up by the fact that visceral attacks are a lot more common than, say, like parries were in boss fights and stuff like that. But this combat system is not an entirely new thing. This combat system is a tweak from a previous combat system. That doesn't mean that Bloodborne doesn't do a good job with its combat system in certain institutions or situations, but that doesn't also mean that it's also like this revolutionary thing that makes the most of all these different ideas, when a lot of these ideas came from previous games.
Because Bloodborne has more direct controls over the kinds of attacks which the player throws out than Dark Souls did.
That's a fucking misrepresentation of Dark Souls. What are you fucking talking about?
From Dark Souls. Because Bloodborne has more direct controls over the kinds of attacks which the player throws out than Dark Souls did.
What the fuck are you talking about? What do you mean more direct control? All of the controls are the same. You have your light attack. You have your heavy attack. In this case, you have your, light regular form attack. Then you have your light transformed. All the moves functionally work the same. It's not like you have a greater control over your moves in this game than you do in the previous ones. That's such a dishonest representation of the controls in Dark Souls and this game. That's such a dishonorable take on it. Now, if you wanted to say that the weapons are a little bit more varied because of the transforming aspect, that is something that you can make an absolute argument for, right? Considering that, all the weapons in this game are very, what's the word? I'm blanking. I'm having a hard brain fart right now. Games are very, it's not diegetic. Fuck. I cannot think of the word right now. They have variables because of the transformation. That's basically what I'm saying, right? If you want to make that argument that the weapons in this game give you more options because of the nature of them being transformation weapons, go ahead, make that point. It's a good argument in Bloodborne's favor. That makes the combat more interesting because you have a weapon that can function as two different things. And I'd cite the Hunter's Axe as a really good example. One-handed, it's very much sort of like a mace weapon, right? But you can also pancake with it. But then when you transform it into its two-handed state, now it's this big sort of halberd type weapon, and you can use it for big sort of group encounters where you can spin around and knock enemies back, as well as dealing with multiple enemies in sort of a radius. Right, and that's just one example. So several of the other weapons do have a functionality that changes depending on what form it's in. But just the way he's characterizing Dark Souls 1 weapons compared is such a dishonest disservice to. I mean, it's really just a disservice to both games because both games have good shit in them. It's just it's a very dishonorable way to phrase this in Bloodborne's favor when Dark Souls has the same shit, even though it might not be technically as deep on a weapon by weapon basis.
Wise from Dark Souls. Because Bloodborne has more direct controls over the kinds of attacks which the player throws out than Dark Souls did, it's able to do more with bosses than Dark Souls could. Let me put it this way. Bar that game's exclusive status ailment vomiters, think curses, every Dark Souls boss, and I'd say this applies to general enemies as well, feels like they could be imported into Bloodborne without any real trouble. If you have hang-ups about this idea because Bloodborne does not have shields, remember that every Dark Souls boss was designed to be beatable by a player using no shields in the first place. If we reverse this boss import idea, however, the same can really only be said of a handful of Bloodborne's bosses into Dark Souls. And
that's also a blatant fucking lie. If you imported every enemy from Bloodborne into Dark Souls 1 and every boss, and you did it appropriately, keyword appropriately, because if you stick something like the amygdala in the asylum, you're guaranteed for a shitty time. This is one thing that you have to remember, is if you're importing, you have to adapt to the style of the game too. Right? So if you take actually, this is a good example. Amygdala, I just complained about with its spazzy moveset, would become trivialized by all the builds that have some sort of ranged functionality, whether that be magic, pyromancer, or whatever you have. Now, since the amygdala is sort of like an arcane creature in Bloodborne, it would probably be resistant to magic, but you get the point, right? Is that, you can port these things from one game to another and they would largely function the same. Just the way you deal with them would shift because you don't have the same mechanics working in your favor in one game as you do when you take them and port them into another, right? Like you don't have the rally system if you're playing Dark Souls. You also don't have a bunch of, parry options and, blood vials if you import a Bloodborne boss into Dark Souls, right? Like this is something that he's making a lot right now, is just false equivalencies, or some of them are false equivalencies and some of them are, I'm not sure what the term would be, but just comparisons that are massively misrepresentative of the earlier title in favor of this game. And that's something that becomes really annoying upon watching this whole thing. The bias shows like heavily. And granted, I've had moments where the bias comes out in some of my videos too, but like I'll at least admit I'm biased on certain things. So let's get back and get that whole point again.
If we reverse this boss import idea, however, the same can really only be said of a handful of Bloodborne's bosses into Dark Souls, and very few of those bosses tend to rank in people's top 10s. These are your Witch of Hemwicks, your Man-Eater boars, your Beast-Possessed Souls, your Undead Giants, etc. It's usually not enough for a video game's experience to be impressive in a vacuum for it to resonate. Often, it's the way the experience is conveyed with the mechanics on hand that makes it stand out. And for combat, I think the Amygdala boss fight was a really good example of just this.
I think it's a real shame that we don't get to see more of the world outside of Yharnam.
The Forbidden Woods.
Well, he's just gonna drop that point and then move on. Wow. I mean, again, everything he just said, like if you take a boss from Bloodborne and then put it into Dark Souls, it could still function. Now, the character is probably not built to deal with it, obviously, because Bloodborne is more aggressive. There's less focus on blocking and a lot more focus on dodging and parrying, right? So mechanically, the Dark Souls player would struggle with any Bloodborne boss. But you put any Elden Ring boss in Dark Souls and you don't adjust anything, the Dark Souls player is going to have trouble too, right? The games have become more aggressive as they've gone along, right? And that includes in like Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring, which are very much in a Demon Souls sort of style, similar to Dark Souls. You know, I just the more I watch this video, the more I get kind of tired of the false equivalencies and the blatant, either disregard or misrepresentation of previous systems and the way they work in comparison to Bloodborne. It's something that really gets annoying, hearing him compare things that are obviously similar, but he makes them seem way more different than they actually are. That's something that I think doesn't really add to the conversation in the video. Because it's like, if you want to talk about games, you need to be fair to what each game can do and what each game was able to do at the time in comparison to sort of what other games did at the time, in either from the same company or from the same franchise, right? It's one of those weird, annoying things that gets me about this video is just his kind of, it's almost a disregard for things that came before Bloodborne, while also simultaneously trying to steal credit from older titles and saying that Bloodborne either did it first or Bloodborne does it better. When a lot of times it's just the same idea again, but now with the new systems in place, you can deal with it.
Is strangely enough a woods that are forbidden, and not an urban gothic monstrosity like Yarnum City is. This makes for a different sort of geometry, one less concerned with straight angles, and I think the game might have benefited from more of these. The ramshackle houses here often include breakable walls leading to secret areas, and the trademarked From Software level design is able to stretch a bit here since it has different constraints on it. Bloodborne did not upgrade to the jumping from souls and has no, real climbing mechanics to speak of. I don't know if you want to count climbing up a ladder. So it's surprising how engaging it can be to maneuver through the levels here.
Kind of like, let's say, Blighttown can be interesting because of all the ladders and different platforms. I think I know where he's going with this, but just keep in mind that other games have done things similar to this in the past.
Everything is mapped out like the old dungeon crawlers used to be, where tunnels have optional paths and the entire area is littered with loot to entice players to get a bit lost. Bloodborne is Kingsfield in its DNA, and not just in the Chalice dungeons. The Souls games are very iterative on much of From Software's older stuff, with the main difference being the third-person camera. Kingsfield and Shadow Tower both played from the first-person perspective. I theorize that this perspective change might have had something to do with the most impactful game on Miyazaki's career being Fumito Ueda's Ico, and surprisingly, it took until Sekiro for FromSoft to match the level design to this perspective shift. Before FromSoft went all in on the third person, Demon's Souls was planned to be playable in both perspectives. Miyazaki suggested in an interview that this had to do with Sony wanting to have an exclusive to compete with Bethesda's Oblivion, but that obviously got changed a bit and the third-person perspective stuck. Even so, Demon's Souls still functions if you swap the camera perspectives. Nothing in the map layout there is too difficult for Kingsfield 4 alumni to handle, and much the same could be said of Dark Souls.
Now, I didn't play anything pre-Demon's Souls, so that's sort of my weak point in terms of like him referencing older shit. I do want to stress that if you do change the camera angle, or not the angle, but the camera position in Dark Souls and Demon's Souls, combat will be heavily affected by that, because when you have sort of what is essentially a dodge mechanic that relies on timing of a particular attack along with your specific positioning, having that third person camera view is really good because you have more reference points for when you have to dodge. And it works similarly to the way our sight works, where you have your two eyes, and the reason that we have good depth perception is because we have two eyes instead of one, right? If we had one eye, we have no idea how far away something is, as if we had two eyes, right? We have two reference points to see how far away something is, whereas if we just have the one, we can't judge it as well as if we have two, and coming back to the camera position point, Dark Souls 1 and Demon's Souls would be drastically affected in terms of how you would learn to time dodges if you did it in a first-person perspective, because you don't have that third-person camera where you can see the actual distance between your character and the object relative to where your camera is. And it's something that I think he might bring up in a second, but it is something that should be mentioned, is that if you do change the POV in the games, you will have to adapt your timing accordingly, because you've built the system to work with a third-person view, and that third-person view can help with managing movement, because you can see your character and see everything around them, as well as when the attack is going to hit you. When you've got something that's, it's similarly to if you see a car coming down the road. If you see a car about to hit somebody, and you're on the sidewalk, you have a better perspective of that than the person actually walking on the, walking like across the road or whatever. Because you can see the target and what is heading towards the target. When you are the target, you can't see the target, so you can only see what's coming. And that affects when you're able to time things, because you don't have a good idea of distance unless you're just really, really good at figuring that shit out through experience or whatever. But anyway, let's get back to what he's talking about.
Alumni to handle, and much the same could be said of Dark Souls. Dark Souls' maps were built from the ground up to be played in third person, and so were Bloodborne's. But if you cut all of the combat out of those games, the areas themselves could still be navigated in first person, because the integration of the player's spatial awareness as it relates to navigating levels didn't really become a big feature until Sekiro included a jump and a grappling hook.
All that I would agree with. Sekiro is sort of the first game where they said, hey, we're going to do parkour right for a change and quit making you guys sprint and then jump and then fail and then fall and die a lot. Which, that is one thing that I can say about Sekiro, is that it was very nice to actually be able to move around in different ways, as opposed to just sort of run everywhere or walk everywhere.
Bloodborne's combat is way too fast to be playable in first person, but the levels might survive such a transition fairly well, which just goes to show how mechanics impact design. For all of the talk these games get about their interconnected and vertical level design, it's not often noted that they achieved it without making the player climb and jump everywhere. And careful attention to level design made sure that players en masse never asked, why can't I just climb up this? Dark Souls 2 being the outlier, of course.
Earlier in this video, I was talking.
I want to go back.
Why can't to level making the player climb level design? It's not often noted that they achieved it without making the player climb and jump everywhere. And careful attention to level design made sure that players en masse never asked, why can't I just climb up this? Dark Souls 2 being the outlier, of course.
Dark Souls 2 being the outlier. What do you mean by Dark Souls 2 being the outlier? I mean, I would say that the level design of these levels are good, not because they aren't, super complicated vertically, but it's because they work in a way that gels well with exploration while also dealing with the interconnectedness of the world as a whole. Like there's it's very easy to take a world and then just splat this area here and say, okay, to the west of this area is this area, to the southwest of the original area is this area, and to the north is this area, right? It's very easy to just plop shit sort of on a board. It's also very easy to do the same vertically, right? You just stack a level on top of each other and find one central point that lets them go between them, right? It's actually very easy to make levels work vertically or horizontally. The thing that makes the Souls levels particularly engaging on that front is because they blend the two of them quite a lot, where you're able to see where you're going, and geographically you make it to that position, and you can see where you were, and everything is cohesive. Like, the levels make sense going from A to B, right? Like in Dark Souls 1, there's a lot of great examples of, if you look anywhere and see another location from a particular spot in the game, you can usually go there, and it will usually work physically with the way the world level design works. You know, Bloodborne is sort of similar in that regard, where you can see certain locations from other locations, and you can reach them physically in the world, you know, in a way that is logically consistent with the way going from point A to point B works in terms of a physical location existing and you being able to perceive that location from different points and it still being static in terms of the actual location itself existing. You know, that's the, you know, the pros of the level design of Soulswork isn't really just because you can't climb a thing or you can climb a thing here and there. It's because they all work in tandem to work with each other, that when you do climb, you climb to a space that you need to get to so that things can connect appropriately for progression's sake or for the world design's sake. But anyway, let's see what he has to say about this.
Of course. Earlier in this video, I was talking about how the game's animations prioritized feeling good over looking good in regards to us being able to run at a wall. I made the point there that players only have their expectations of realism betrayed when the game established that they should have those. And I think the level design picks up on this philosophy as well. When you can't climb every surface, players don't feel betrayed when they aren't allowed to climb a specific gate unless we have a really poorly designed level. Again, certain areas in Dark Souls 2. Alternatively, if the experience does not manage to get the player invested, the game will not be able to easily shield itself from those sorts of questions either. A work that puts in the effort to prioritize internal consistency can usually get away with departures from reality, provided they are consistent in the game all throughout. Another exception players will make is for the sake of gameplay.
That whole point he just made is something I totally agree with. It's not necessarily about it being realistic, it's about internal consistency.
Bloodborne allows us to pick up items, but it doesn't have extensive animations of the hunter bending down and picking the things up. Overextended animations are very rarely appreciated because games are dynamic. Once the player prompts the game to pick something up, there's no involved part of the action left, so the game can just skip the realism and let our guy have the item. That's not to say that there couldn't be more decisions in the interim between prompting a pickup and the actual pickup, but since Bloodborne does not have any, it's probably better that it keeps things moving at a tolerable pace. A quick note on pickups. An interesting quirk of psychology is that unpredictable rewards are more addicting than predictable ones are. In a vacuum, a 10% drop rate hooks players more than guaranteed drops every 10th enemy killed. I say in a vacuum because in case the player has some priority to the interaction, say they are speedrunning, they might not take as kindly to RNG. In addition to some recurring themes, Miyazaki also has certain characters he likes to remix and reuse, and the Afflicted Beggar is this game's version of Demon Souls' Yurt, or Lautrec from Dark Souls. I noted earlier that Alfred's design documents have a note saying he should be like Solaire, and the other returning faces include the Level Lady, Demon Souls' Maiden in Black, and Dark Souls' Anastasia of Astora, being the doll. You could also argue that Imposter Yosefka is an adaptation of Demon Souls' Mephistopheles, and there's of course Patches, who is pretty unchanged, discounting that he's a Spider-Man now. The Afflicted Beggar is here to punish altruistic players. If you send him to Erdene Chapel, he will work his way through the NPCs there until he's been killed. We could send him to Imposter Yosefka, where he'll get a taste of his own medicine, but I want to fight him in his beast mode, and I also want to kill the skeptical man to punish his rudeness towards me, so I'm actually gonna invite this guy over. Story-wise, this is probably my favorite interpretation of this character, but gameplay-wise, I rarely bother meeting him. Bloodborne's NPCs are simply not of as much value to the player as the NPCs in Souls are, so this story is massively undercut.
I bet there are even players out there who, on their first run, might have rescued this guy and never figured out that he kills NPCs because there's no point to ever going back to Eden Chapel. I've said my piece on the alterations to hubs made in the game and some of the positive and negative ramifications of this change, so I won't dwell on this much longer. Obviously, though, this is a story which suffers from the player being so independent of their non-Hunter's Dream hubs and of the NPCs. Much like how it took Sekiro's jumping to finally have FromSoft reassess their approach to level design to incorporate the player's ability to quickly observe the area, I would have liked it if Bloodborne's development had the team wake up a bit to how they approach their NPC stories, had them decide to make the stories fit the world as the player navigates it, rather than once again dropping the...
How long have we got to ROM? See, Bergenworth starts at about the 3-hour mark, and ROM looks like about halfway through there, so probably about 20 minutes, give or take. I'm trying to kind of let this play sometimes, but we're getting there. I'm trying to get to ROM as best I can.
Development had the team wake up a bit to how they approach their NPC stories, had them decide to make the stories fit the world as the player navigates it, rather than once again dropping the best of Miyazaki in the game, hoping they still get the love. This isn't a point of criticism I particularly want to linger on, firstly because Demon's Souls and Dark Souls had this pretty down pat, and because we know that maps used to be more dynamic, and it's entirely possible that these characters are holdovers from an earlier build where the player might have interacted with them more organically than they do now.
He's being decent with only some dodgy observations. Feel we've made more progress in the last few episodes. Yeah, I mean, it really just, like, progress really just depends on what he says. You know, I mean, that's really it. Like, if he has a bunch of things that are just agreeable, or at the very least, like, opinionated, you know, and we can debate them, then, you know, there's no real issue or holdup. So, I mean, I also kind of want to get to ROM because I want to talk about ROM. But we'll see. We'll see if we can. I'm gonna try to stream for a little bit extra today, just to try to get to ROM, just because we're kind of close. So we'll hopefully get there. Usually it's Dark Souls bad, Bloodborne good from him. Yeah. I mean, again, we'll see. We'll see what he says, and we'll see how it goes.
I'm just bringing this up in case this isn't ever corrected.
Dark Souls 2 and 3 were the victims of mid-development overhauls, and Sekiro's story was much more conventionally told.
I make this point often, but certain games do certain things better or worse.
And it is very rarely a good idea to structure an experience in a game on top of something that game does poorly. It can work really well if there is something being communicated with the juxtaposition, or if the absence of gameplay challenge convergence produces interesting results, like I talked about earlier with Souls platforming, Silent Hill, open exteriors, cramped spaces in Bloodborne, etc. But usually games do better when they do what they do well, rather than when they try to overload the bar with weight they can't quite lift. Bloodborne does a lot of things very well. Sending the player back to Eden Chapel so that they can see the NPC stories play out around them over time is not one of those things. It works, and you can watch those stories if you want, but it's an effort, which it didn't used to be.
Walter over here is one of the Covenant leaders. Specifically, he directs the League, which he formed after a trio he was involved with got killed by a beast they had chased to Yharnam. After killing and devouring the whole beast, Walter obtained the Impurity Rune and formed the League, whose mission is hunting down vermin, which are centipede-like beings which live in filth and are said to be the source of man's impurity. These things can only be seen by the Confederates of the League, because only they have the Impurity Rune, which is also the Oath Rune of the Covenant. It's basically a jolly cooperation covenant, except instead of collecting sun metals, we collect vermin. And vermin in this game are basically the opposite of phantasms. The phantasms are the slugs which are associated with arcane and can be seen in much of the arcane artwork. Vermin are connected to beasts. The impurity rune is called stagnation in Japanese, which has to do with the theme of flow, which Miyazaki goes to in his games very often. In Japan, still waters are sometimes seen as bad and flowing waters are seen as good. Still waters are stagnant, and so they are where parasites hatch their larvae, knowing they won't be swept away by the flow. Vermin show up in stagnant blood, as it is a breeding ground for parasites, just like how stagnant water is parasitic and bad, as you saw in the water underneath Yosefka's clinic, which dealt poison and had maggot enemies in it, and stuff like dirty blood gems, as well as the water in the Nightmare Frontier, which also dealt poison. If we collect and crush enough vermin, Walter will eventually abandon his post as the Master of the League, and will be able to pick up his helmet. Usually, its item description reads, an iron helm resembling an upside-down bucket. A single hole allows one to peek out with a single eye, which is probably all that its original owner had. But if players complete his quest line, it won't be called One-Eyed Iron Helm, it'll be called Master's Iron Helm. And its description will also feature the line, the Iron Helm is passed down among Masters of the League.
Walter had in fact lost the ability to see vermin long ago. And I think the implication of him leaving the helmet is that he is giving the leadership of the League over to the player after seeing their conviction at destroying vermin. Their item description reads, a centipede-like creature discovered on successful hunts by League hunters. Vermin, found hidden in filth, are only seen by League confederates and are the root of man's impurity. The League has assumed the task of finding and crushing all vermin. Perhaps there is some mercy in the madness. Those who wish to see vermin can, and those who choose to are provided with boundless purpose. The Forbidden Woods area is very focused all throughout to showcase vermin. We see villagers whose heads explode from a snake infestation. We see ticks on the gigantic snakes, and we might also be seeing the color out of space. Way back when I talked about the Lovecraft stories which seemingly inspired this game, I noted the color out of space, but I didn't really explain how it connects to the game. Go to this timestamp if you want to read that story for yourself. Okay, so the color out of space has a meteorite land on a farmland and slowly begin to corrupt it, its vegetation, and its inhabitants. And in the Forbidden Woods, we had Patches gift us the Tonsil Stone. If we surmise that the Tonsil Stone actually fell down from the Nightmare Frontier, the stone is theorized to be a meteorite, then it's possible that it carried the rot of the Nightmare Frontier with it. Lawrence came to beasts, so assumably it is a treasure trove of vermin. The Forbidden Woods has giant mushrooms which resemble the heads of the amygdalas. It has humans who live in filthy water. It has snake parasites. It has ticks on the giant snakes, and much like the Nightmare Frontier itself, this area is littered with tombstones. So I think the idea might be that the nightmare is reproducing itself here. In the Miyazaki flow theme, very often flow and stagnation are represented with elevation, where flow comes from above. It is rain, it is waterfalls, it is sunlight, all those forces which give life. And stagnation is at the bottom, where the rain sinks into the ground, where the river ends, and pools and sinks, etc. And another component of this theme is that it seemingly has a higher standing in his works when it comes to adjudicating the morality of his worlds. It's not good and evil, it's vitality and stagnation. Demon Souls showcased stagnation in the Valley of Defilement, as well as in True King Alant, who was located in the lowest elevation in that entire game. Dark Souls has this with the Great Lords. Each one is situated after a descent. They sit in stagnant depths. And the golden city of Anor Orlando was just a front, and Gwyn was really located, like Alant, in the lowest elevation in the game because he was the source of that world's stagnation. Here, Menzies and the Choir occupy the lowest and highest elevation in Yharnam respectively. Changing topic real quick, FromSoft's games are fairly diegetic considering their genre.
The player direction is mostly done by the world, and it's rare that the game decides to go for a cutscene to let the player know what to do next. Players expect every gauntlet in the game to end in a boss, and if they're curious enough, they'll just go through each gauntlet, whether or not they know what the story is expecting of them, and they go kill the boss. Bloodborne is scripted to be a mystery, so the setup works fairly well. First time through, the hunter and the player are both in the dark about what is to come, but the game does just fine getting the player from beginning to end. In terms of visual information, the game is pretty understated as well. The HUD, lock-on point, and health bars don't actually exist in the world, but any less information in the game would be almost unplayable.
This is... I've had like nothing to say for the past like 5 minutes, I think. But yeah, I'm still here. Just wanted to mention that. We're getting through this. I think we're getting actually pretty close to Bergenworth here in a minute, so that should be fun.
The non-intrusive narrative of the game makes for a very player-driven experience. That said, there are some tricks here and there to get the most out of the players. Some intentional, some maybe not so much. Among the most impressive is how Bloodborne directs combat like how scoring systems do in character action games. Yep.
Compared to the action in the Bayonettas of the world, Bloodborne is incredibly primitive, but the idea of using visual information to push the player to a certain feel of playstyle is still on full display. In Devil May Cry, the constant stream of visual information from combat both rewarded players who played with style and communicated to them that that is what they were doing. In God of War, the style system rewarded and communicated brutality. Here, combat is about fighting for one's life, and the two mechanics which manage to simulate a style meter are the rally mechanic and blood vials. The blood vials, which we use for healing, cap out at 20. Everyone picked up after that goes into the player's storage where they sit until the player dies with less than 20 vials. When respawning, the difference is made up by subtracting vials from that storage. Games tend to pivot to optimal play because players like to show off to themselves. And optimal play in Bloodborne on quick glance seems to be clean, not
And we're getting there. We're making some good progress now.
losing health, that
almost
is.
at Rome. Almost.
But upon a bit of introspection, it becomes apparent that there is an even higher level of play available because damage can be recovered with the rally mechanic. The player can actually take blows but still come out of an engagement unharmed with 20 blood vials. This requires some knowledge about enemy hit damage and the intricacies of the rally mechanic, but you can go through the game faster by letting some hits go through. And so the highest level of play does not actually have a player be unharmed, it has them at full health at the end of every encounter. And so the encounter is not about careful dodging, it's about taking the most optimal number of hits. Get this, gang, raw optimization makes Bloodborne a game where losing health is not necessarily a telltale sign of subpar play.
I mean, it literally is, though. I mean, all of these games can be completed with no hit runs. People have done it. People have done it over and over. You are doing something that is subpar than perfection, which exists, which is doable, which people have done. it's kind of a point that makes these games kind of cool, is that you can play the entirety of the game, without taking damage. It is possible. So let's just go back and let him get his final point out there.
Raw optimization makes Bloodborne a game where losing health is not necessarily a telltale sign of subpar play. You are being directed to slug it out here. But let's not go too far. Bloodborne does not have extensive mechanics to handle enemies like juggling in Devil May Cry or anything quite so fancy. It's just able to jerry-rig up a phantom style meter to get the message of its combat across. And compared to those games, Bloodborne's flow of information is so subdued, and the display is incredibly clean. Of course, Bloodborne does not have the depth to convey, nor the fine-tuning of those games, so a comparison is not really fair. I'm not saying Bloodborne is a sneaky character action game, but rather that it directs the theme of its combat using some of the same tricks. And because it has no actual score at the end, players aren't funneled to a specific playstyle. Once developers attach numbers to actions, there comes the perception of there being objective ways of playing better. But developers can get numbers wrong, and when they do, more skilled players might get a lower score than someone who is just chasing numbers. Now, one can argue over whether getting numbers is the mark of skill, as that is the bar which the developers set, or whether the arbitrary values assigned to actions by developers should be regarded as sacred. If one is to argue that, however, they can kindly do that in another video's comment section. I'm more interested in what happens when a game's action is directed to congeal to a theme without any score to distract the player. Bloodborne puts in the effort to make players fight for their lives, but so long as their health is good and vials plentiful, there's nothing telling the player that their approach is invalid or subpar. There are gradients to the quality of every build, and they vary in their individual capacities to deal with problems, but within the parameters of surviving the encounter, Bloodborne isn't fussy about how you get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty true. All of what he said is pretty true about these games compared to other games that have like a scoring system. But I mean, this is also a thing where this also works with like all the other games that From Software has like made like before this and after this. As with I don't even really know what a gamer score is. like I just play games. I think he's talking more along the lines of things like sort of like Resident Evil, where it gives you sort of a rating at the end in terms of games that give you some sort of rating for how successful you are at the game based on their sort of arbitrary number crunching of how well you did. The Resident Evil games usually have a rating at the end of your playthrough. Did you get like an S rank, A, B, C, however low it goes. I think he's talking more about that specifically than getting like a big number. But then again, he mentioned Devil May Cry. I've never played Devil May Cry, so I have no idea how that scores things. But I think his overall point is that some games make certain things seem optimal when they aren't really. And I think that was his main point. I think that was his main point for that whole little spiel. Is that sometimes you can beat a game, and in some games you can be more optimized if you don't, play by those sort of number crunching rules. So that's what. Okay, gamer score is like a platinum on PlayStation. Okay, thank you for telling me, Andrew. I've not used an Xbox, so we are compiling knowledge together, and that is a good thing. But anyway, we are near the end of Forbidden Woods, getting into Bergenworth. Rom's here, sort of.
If you fought for your life using Carol runes to recover Quicksilver bullets, good job. If you fought for your life by hurling Molotov cocktails at a boss out of nowhere, good job. If you fought for your life by having a flexible arsenal and you cycled through each weapon as it became the optimal one, good job. Every approach gets 0 points, so all are equally valid. Success is all that matters. Your reward isn't some trophy, but rather it's the sense of accomplishment which follows the desperate fight. It is often useful to alter the paradigm you're using to analyze a game, because it shows just how universal the language of good game direction really is. And it also forces you to ruminate on just how guided an experience can be with just the inclusion of a single mechanic. During development of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, Sandy Peterson, its creator, decided that a key component of Lovecraft's stories were their cinematic nature, in that so many of the stories are cemented by specific moments, like Cthulhu waking up, or the deep ones coming from the ocean, or the shootout in the Whisperer in Darkness. And Lovecraft is not about how people overcome those moments, but rather how they succumb to them and how they are tormented by them onwards. This was where the sanity mechanic came from, and it allowed for older PCs to return in later modules as villains. After incorporating a sanity system into Call of Cthulhu, Peterson had a moment in playtesting where players were conducting a ritual and half of them decided for their PC to close their eyes to not see the ritual take place. The sanity system therefore managed to make players simulate being afraid, because averting danger was a better survival strategy than combat. And so Peterson stumbled onto a mechanic which managed to produce Lovecraft characters who automatically engage with the settings brand of role-playing.
My favorite moments in video games are usually produced by interacting with some system and discovering that it managed to tell a story, like the moon in Majora's Mask, like Yorda in Eco, and like the inventory in Silent Hill 2. And this is probably why I make such a big deal about how little developer interference there is in these games.
Bloodborne's gameplay naturally tells the story of fighting for one's life, and the setting oozes the eldritch. So that's the story which the game tells, and it doesn't need any elaborate cutscenes or scripted events to deliver on this better.
Even though it has cutscenes that deliver important pieces of information that add on to this effect. Like the famous cutscenes that happen here in Bergenworth.
Any elaborate cutscenes or scripted events to deliver on this better. I still would have liked to see the version of Bloodborne where dynamic maps responded to insight, but even without it, the game does a good job of getting the player to tell its story. I'm using the Shaman's Bone Blade I got from the Brainsucker to turn the fluorescent flower to our side momentarily. Bergenworth is where the main game really introduces the player to kin enemies, and the descent into the lake will be the moment where Bloodborne finally tips over into making the cosmicism the focus rather than being blurry environmental hints. Aside from Yuri, the last scholar, every enemy in this area is kin. So I've talked about serrated and righteous weapons, but there's another way the game handles damage. Enemies can be grouped into the categories of beast, kin, and non-affiliated. Beasts are pretty self-explanatory, but kin are best categorized by looking at their skin. If the enemy in front of you looks more like an alien than a dog, it's probably kin. And certain weapons have specific qualities that grant extra damage to these enemies. Blood gems can also be inserted to deal with them better, and a good heuristic for assessing your foe is, if it has fur, fire. If it has watery skin, bolt. And before you ask, no, the damage modifier for beasts here is not the same as the serrated damage modifier. Why have 3 distinct damage classes when you can have 2 sets of 2 and double up on beasts? Yuri over here is a member of the choir, and she's seemingly positioned here to keep hunters from attacking Rom. The choir is on to Mensis' ritual, so lore-wise, this is the best reasoning I can gather.
In this area, we can summon Mensis scholar Damien to help us kill Rom, and I'll actually bring him into the fight against Yuri because she's kinda kicking my ass right now. After reviewing this footage, I can tell there's obviously some input delay here. You can't see it, but my timing on the gun is much better than the game is registering.
On a serious note though, I think this fight will be a good showcase of why I'm not the biggest fan of the online in these games. Conceptually, I like it, but aside from the horrendous lag, it doesn't seem to be balanced around good play. Me and Damien are juggling Yuri, and she's completely locked out of responding. One-on-ones in these games can be very good, but it is very rare that two-on-ones are anything other than frustrating because there aren't any mechanics designed to balance it out for the outnumbered player. There could be a bravery stat, which is temporarily granted to players who are outnumbered in online, which makes it impossible for them to be caught in recovery animation loops or something like that. Whether online should be completely fair is another question entirely, however. I don't think invaders, for example, really deserve for the invaded player to be capped from summoning help, so if this was ever going to be changed, I think it'd be best if it were done on a case-by-case basis. The Mensis Choir War is, I think, a great example of utilizing different mechanics to tell the story, as we just saw with Damien and Yuri. And when it comes to storytelling in Bloodborne in general, if there's anything that feels like a crutch, it might be the game's reliance on item descriptions. FromSoft has experimented with different ways of feeding the player information about the world, but the subdued and optional nature of their experiments makes those unreliable since players might very easily miss them. Bloodborne has notes scattered around which give cryptic hints to events which might play out later, but item descriptions are where most of the story takes place. The novelty of this kind of storytelling hasn't been completely exhausted, if you ask me, but if the NPCs in the world could be incorporated into the game better, they could do some of the heavy lifting of telling the story. And I also think, in general, interacting with NPCs is just always going to feel more impactful than reading the item descriptions. I remember my first meeting with Solaire. I don't remember when I first read what any of his items were about. And my favorite moments in these games usually have to do with interacting with the NPCs. That's not to say that I want item descriptions to go away. I'm just curious what a game like this would look like if it had more interactions with the...
There she is. Rom. Ah, man, so ugly.
people in its world. Funnily enough, from unused dialogue, we can assume there was a fetch quest in Bergenworth where Willem had the player collect eyes in the Institute. Back then, the lecture hall, which I entered to get to the Nightmare Frontier, was still the ground level of Bergenworth, so there was some actual meat to this place. Considering Lawrence got some play in the DLC, Willem is probably the most underwhelming character we meet in the game, considering how significant he is to the happenings around us. You'd think something interesting could be done with him, so it's a bit of a shame that he's just a brain-dead plant man at this point. I suppose it highlights how his pursuit for insight has fried his brain, so his inclusion here is on theme, but I wonder what a character like him could have brought to the story if he had been more active. His quest was seemingly repurposed for Adeline in the DLC, and considering that there are mushrooms growing on Willem's back, in retrospect, it really seems like Bergenworth should have been where the player acquired the Milkweed Rune and where the arcane builds finally opened up. The DLC runes have not been found to have existed in any pre-DLC builds of the game, That might change with time, though I don't think it will. So hindsight is 2020. The Milkweed rune is another example of what I talked about earlier, with the game having a poor handling of dealing out builds. Currently, and seemingly in earlier builds, Willem drops the eye rune when killed. Fitting, considering he had the player collect eyes for him, and also fitting because, like arcane levels, the eye rune boosts item discovery. The fetch quest might have gotten caught because the boss arena being locked behind the fetch quest played poorly, and the absence of purpose to the lecture hall in the current setup might be why they were repurposed as the entrance to the nightmares. Alternatively, the lecture hall was cut out and made the entrance to the nightmare, and there wasn't time to give Willem anything else to do. Much like Willem himself, I find Byrgenwerth in its current form to be somewhat of a disappointment, considering its significance in the story, but the fight between Damien and Yuri and the fight against Rom go a long way to redeem this place.
Oh, no, 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 no. I disagree with that entirely. I think most of this area is shit. I think most of this area is terrible.
Rom was a student of Byrgenwerth who was able to partially ascend. Byrgenwerth had the third umbilical cord from the fishing hamlet and used it to transform Rom.
Has he mentioned Rom at all during this boss fight? He just did. It took him, I think, about 2 minutes to do so. But granted, he was ranting about something else, so I'm kind of okay with that. But still, it is a thing where we should talk about this mechanically, because, oh boy, this thing is annoying. This is one thing that I was actually thinking of while he was showing his previous fight footage. Was I think the fight could have actually been balanced a little bit if the arcane attacks damaged the spiders too. I think that would make the fight a little bit more bearable, just because the spiders are probably one of the more annoying aspects of the entire encounter here.
Into a brain dead Great One, or at least an incomplete Great One. A note in the lecture hall says to hunt the Great Ones, and another note says 3/3 chords. So eventually these guys were able to piece together that Rom was imperfect because they needed more third umbilical cords. I'll be fetching the Byrgenwerth cord near the end of this video, and I'll go more into what exactly these things are. But short story, they are the bond between the Great Ones and their stillborn infants. The Mensis scholars are currently conducting a ritual to beckon the moon presence, which will reveal the red moon. Once it descends, Yharnam will be drowned in madness, and Rom is the only thing that is currently holding the red moon from descending. Rom is said to be vacuous, which I think simply means it has the mental faculties of a human being rather than that of a Great One, which might explain how it's able to know what it's doing. And Rom might actually be located near the Altar of Despair, so what we are fighting right now might possibly be a mental projection of Rom which exists in the Dreamlands. There are many such cases going forward, since this is the point where Bloodborne nosedives into wonderful insanity. Rom might be more aware than she lets on, and might have learned about the Mensis ritual from the choir, or maybe there is some natural instinct which is guiding it, but regardless, we're gonna genocide Yharnam in a bit because we really want to fight more bosses. Sorry, not sorry. Much like the amygdala, Rom is a boss which encapsulates the changed design sensibilities of bosses from Souls.
You can really see the diversity of Bloodborne's weapons while he's fighting Rom. If only Dark Souls had such options. I know, right? It's like, who wouldn't want to play a game where you just smack and smack and smack and smack?
Every hit here eats well into the player's health, and if you don't take care of them quickly, the small spider enemies can quickly overwhelm you with sheer numbers. This isn't as big a drain on resources as it would be in Souls, because the rally mechanic should be the first healing option the player considers, but the damage, mixed with the sheer magnitude of enemies, makes dashing through the fight the best strategy. This is an example of a boss which really leans into Bloodborne's unique quirks. Rom is Miyazaki's favorite boss, though when he said that, he stipulated if you ignore the gameplay itself. He finds Rom's model and animations to be cute, apparently, and he enjoys the atmosphere here. And that's a really interesting word, atmosphere. Universally, I think people's favorite bosses tend to always overrepresent those who had a specific sort of atmosphere rather than those who were fun to fight. Goes back to what I said earlier about how the best parts of the FromSoft games experiences tend to be outside of the combat. With the...
I mean, these are action-heavy games with bosses that are pretty well made usually, so I think those are the highlights for most people. Let's go back a little bit. I'm still laughing about him talking about all this diversity of fighting in Bloodborne, and then he just does the exact same strategy over and over with Rom. That was pretty funny.
Word, atmosphere. Universally, I think people's favorite bosses tend to always overrepresent those who had a specific sort of atmosphere rather than those who were fun to fight.
So the atmosphere of bosses are usually the ones with the better atmosphere rather than ones that are fun to fight, that are overrepresented amongst people's favorites. Is that what he's saying? Really, Miyazaki said he never plays any games he's involved with? That's kind of telling that you don't want to play your game. But I can kind of see, like, if you would not want to play your own game because you probably spend years working on it and you're kind of like, I don't want to play it. Maybe it's a situation where he's just not good at his own games. I always found that to be kind of funny. It's like when people make their own art that they can't, like, do. You know what I mean? It's like when artists make songs they can't perform, right? Or when like game directors make games they can't finish themselves. I always found that kind of weird. But let's go back again.
Bosses tend to always overrepresent those who had a specific sort of atmosphere rather than those who were fun to fight.
Those are not mutually exclusive. If you Google it, he said he never plays any of his games. I respect that. He throws it out there for people. Yeah, I mean, at least he's being honest about it. You know, some people, like, you know, a lot of people, you know, that work for Star Wars right now, I bet don't even really know, like, when Han gets frozen in carbonite. You know, they probably don't know which movie that is. It's like when you, like, there's a funny clip, I think it's of Leslie Headland, one of the people over at Star Wars. When she was asked what her favorite Star Wars film was, she said, all of them. I love all the Star Wars. And it's like, you couldn't come up with a more basic bitch, just sort of like fake fan answer. You know, at least Miyazaki admits that he doesn't play his games. You know, like, I'd take honesty over sequel trilogies proof they didn't understand Star Wars. Oh, yeah, hell yeah. I might cover those one day. We'll see. You know, but yeah, at least when, like, I can take honesty over trying to just bullshit your way through it. You know, I will always take honesty, even if it's something that I vehemently disagree with. You know, because I'd rather you be honest and have your side, and me be honest and have my side, than both of us trying to bullshit each other with some lie over what's real and what's not. You know, it's like, it's kind of annoying. But anyway, let's get back to his boss point, because I feel like he's about to make a really dumb point.
Goes back to what I said earlier about how the best parts of the FromSoft games experiences tend to be outside of the combat. With the descent of the Red Moon, we see Queen Yharnam weep for her lost child Murgo. The Red Moon will allow for Mensis to call out to the Great Ones, And Queen Yarnum's presence here seems to suggest that this area is located in the Dreamlands, though you can warp to the lantern here through the Frontier headstone, so it seems like the game doesn't register it as such. Bloodborne has sort of cemented its legacy as a Lovecraftian game.
Well, he's just gonna completely he completely threw out that point about bosses, then just moved past it without substantiating it at all. He was just like, some people really like bosses with an aesthetic over being actually good. Okay, I'm done. Next point. It's like, dude, you just made a huge criticism of bosses throughout the games. You need to substantiate it. Like, what the fuck, dude? Like, if you're going to criticize a lot of bosses with just that fell swoop, you need to give some examples at least. At least one. Like, give at least one example of a boss whose aesthetic is cool, but mechanically isn't that fun. I mean, this is one thing that I try to do a lot, is whenever I have a point, I try to give an example of what I mean so people can understand where I'm coming from. And it also helps illustrate my point when I give an example of what I think is good versus what I think is bad, and then I explain why. When you just throw out a point like that and you don't substantiate it, we have no idea what you fucking mean. We have no idea what you mean. We also have no idea what your basis for that opinion is. Because this is one thing that a lot of people forget, is that it's okay to have opinions, but when you have opinions that are not based in any sort of experience or perspective, they're just sort of an opinion you have because you have them, just because you think you should have that opinion. That's an opinion that's not substantiated by anything, right? And it's one of those things where I wonder if he has a bunch of opinions that are just sort of, he thinks this way because he thinks this way, and he doesn't really have a reason to think these things in a specific way. I wonder about that now. But anyway, we made it past Rom pretty quick. I thought he was going to talk about the boss fight more. I guess this is one of those things where I got to wonder if he kind of went over Rom sort of quietly and kind of quickly, was because he knows Rom is particularly picked on as one of the worst fights in the game. I wonder if he's aware of that, and instead of dealing with the criticisms of Rom's fight, he just kind of skirts over it to move on to something else. Because I think he only covered the actual boss fight portion of that in, I think, for like a minute. Like 1 minute. When you could talk about every boss fight in this game for at least 5. It's just weird. Well, we've reached the 3-hour mark, so that's nice. Maybe we'll finish this thing this year. But anyway, back to the Cthulhu mythos and all this other Lovecraftian stuff that is great to see, but getting kind of annoyed with kind of the lack of points during this sort of section. Yeah. If you Google Miyazaki doesn't play his own games, you can read it, and it's pretty interesting. The hype me and Sheep had 2 weeks ago feels sad. I know, right? I thought he was going to have this epic defense of Rom, or was going to actually dive into the criticisms and like acknowledge some of it as like good or bad, and then explain why. But he was just like, yeah, this fight can be a little ridiculous because of the sheer number of enemies, but it's not that bad. Let's move on. It's like, damn. I really wonder what he's going to do when he covers some of the, like, because I think he goes over some of the Chalice dungeons in here somewhere. Does he? Yeah, he goes over a Chalice dungeon here, so maybe he'll explain some Chalice dungeon stuff. But like, holy shit, he has so much more he needs to talk about that he's just breezing over right now, and it makes me feel like he's kind of skirting on thin ice to get away from Rom as fast as possible, because he knows how shit Rom is. And he can't really defend it without bringing up a lot of problems with the game. But anyway, let's move on.
But it was marketed and sold as a gothic action affair. It's sort of been forgotten in the dialogue that cosmicism was a plot twist. If you didn't find the Nightmare Frontier yet, statistically likely to miss in a first playthrough, it wouldn't be until Rom where the cosmic theme really got going. What I'm trying to say is, Yahar Ghul might not be anyone's favorite level, though I have a certain fondness for it, but it was almost certainly the level where the mask slipped for most players. It might not be your number one, but it was almost certainly one of the most impactful areas on your first run. I think this level, maybe more than any other, suffers from the changes made to the dynamisms in the levels, and I'll talk more about how after we've done some cleanup. I'm gonna go to the Hunter's Dream to level up and make some purchases, and then I'm gonna conclude some NPC stories. One consequence of dedicated builds is that items in the world can quickly become more hassle than they're worth.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about with that point? This isn't like Skyrim where you have a weight limit. You can pick up all the shit in the fucking planet and just have them in your pocket if you want them and if you need them, right? You can hold on to them forever. Until you decide to get rid of them, that's the only time they become a pain, right? Is when you have to get rid of them and sell them and figure out what they sell for, right? Let me back that up.
These stories. One consequence of dedicated builds is that items in the world can quickly become more hassle than they're worth. If you imagined a Bloodborne where we could not sell our items, you'd be imagining a Bloodborne where experienced players would not take the time to explore each area thoroughly. Because most items can be sold, Bloodborne where we could not sell and their dedicated NPC stories.
And yeah, Andrew, he did say earlier the Bloodborne was free because it didn't have builds as much, and it's like, yeah, when you have dedicated builds to the one build that the game sort of pushes you to use, that's freedom. Nothing says freedom than a long corridor with one door at the end. But I really want to get this point that he just made, because there is something worth unpacking there.
One consequence of dedicated builds is that items in the world can quickly become more hassle than they're worth. If you imagined a Bloodborne where we could not sell our items, you'd be imagining a Bloodborne where experienced players would not take the time to explore each area thoroughly.
Why wouldn't they take the time to explore the world early? Might it be because they're experienced and know where shit is that they need? I mean, Imtha is a great example of this, where he will just go through the world picking up items he needs for whatever challenge runs he does, because he's an experienced player that knows where shit is for the build he's using, for the things he's doing, and he knows exactly where to go to get the exact things he needs at exact points in the game, right? Experienced players do this all the time, where where certain shit is, and so you avoid getting a lot of the useless crap because you know where the thing you want specifically is, right? Like, come on. Like, this is one thing too, is resource management in this game is not a troublesome feat, right? Skyrim is a great example of how items matter because you have a weight limit, right? So how much you hold does matter. In these games, doesn't matter at all. You can hold every fucking weapon in the game at once. You know what that affects? Nothing. Nothing. You just have the weapons in your back pocket. That's it. There's no mechanical difference. Now, granted, you have more options because you have more stuff in your inventory, but still, it's like that doesn't like, item management is not a problem in these games as much as when you choose to get rid of them, it can become a problem. Yeah. Now, yeah, and you're right, Andrew, that with Dark Souls, it was a little bit limiting because you couldn't sell things, but he's mentioned it in such a broad sense that I don't know if he's specifically talking about selling things. He does mention, like, imagine a game if we couldn't sell things, but at the same time, it's like, if we couldn't sell things in the game, then the items would become that much more important because we would probably use a lot of them, right? Like all the blood echoes, like the little blood echo thingies that you can pop for blood echoes, sort of like the souls in the Souls games, and the rune things that you see in Elden Ring, right? All those become even more useful when you can't sell things because they're essentially stuff you can save that you don't lose upon death, right? And it's one of those things where, like, I feel like the way he explained this made it come off as he was criticizing item management in general, but I do think that he might be going for more specifically like selling items, just because the other games did have issues with selling items. It was, it's a thing where if you want to kind of clean up your inventory, if you didn't have the right thing unlocked at the right time, you basically had to drop everything, or put it in like storage and then deal with it later, or you had to cycle through it every time you were going through your inventory looking for shit, but sort of it's a thing where like his point kind of makes sense. It's like some of this stuff can be a bit annoying, but at the same time, it's like inventory management isn't really that big of a deal unless you go through the entire game picking up stuff and then don't deal with it until the very end. And it's also a thing too, like this game, along with Elden Ring, along with Dark Souls 3, give you options to sell things very early in the game, like extremely early in the game, right? It's not like Dark Souls 1 where you basically have to, work your way up to selling something to like Framped, or what have you. It's like this game is remarkably more to the point with getting rid of items.
Players would not take the time to explore each area thoroughly. Because most items can be sold, most items, even though you can't use them, offer some tangible benefit to you. And in a weird way, picking up loot is the best insurance policy in the game because held items don't drop with your blood echoes when you die. I made a note earlier that a single mechanic can be enough to make wild changes to the experience, and simply being able to sell items, a mechanic I imagine most people never think twice about, is an example of just that. In this video so far, I might have come across as...
I still remember you trying to do Artorias DLC after you ditched the Sunlight Maggot and not being able to get the silver pendant for Manus. Yeah. Those were fun times. But it is one of those things where like it's good to hold on to items, right? And this is one thing that I think actually I think Dark Souls makes probably the best argument for making items, keeping items on you, is just because there are so many useful things in Dark Souls that you are better off to have. Sunlight Maggot being probably the best example, just because all the ways around using the Sunlight Maggot are very annoying and resource limiting. You know what I mean? Like you mentioned with the trying to find the silver pendant for Manus. If you use any other light creating thing to unlock that little area where the silver pendant is, you have to use like a spell or you have to equip an item like in one of your weapon slots to use it. Whereas with the Sunlight Maggot, you just put it on your head and it just glows. It's incredibly helpful for Tomb of the Giants. Incredibly helpful. It's a thing where you can easily sell that and completely realize after the fact that, wow, I just fucked myself because I don't have an easy light source, because then you have to use the lamp thing and that takes up a weapon slot, which means you effectively get rid of one of your weapons, or you try to fight in the dark, in which case, good luck. I'll see you in the hollow afterlife. But yeah, it is just a weird thing. I'm actually surprised. We've made almost an hour's worth of progress in this just because he said so little about ROM and all this other shit. Oh, me and my ex were going through things. She always laughed whenever you were like, "What the fuck, game?" and kept me being a fan of your channel. I appreciate it. Sometimes the funniest moments that you can have with gaming is watching someone you like fuck up. It's one of the funniest things that you can experience. I have a lot of fun memories playing video games with my best friend or with my brother. And whenever they fuck up, it's hilarious watching them struggle. And it's also funny when I go back and look at me, having just dead brain moments where I make a stupid fucking decision. Then I'm like, oh, that happened. It's fun to laugh at idiots, especially when you're the idiot or one of the idiots.
as negative about the Hunter's Dream. So it might actually surprise you to hear that I actually really like this place. It might not beef up the NPC interactions, but if I'm to be locked to a single hub to access my upgrades and vendors, I can imagine many places that would be worse than this one. If only because it's so small. Being able to compare and contrast the cost of items sold by the Blood Echoes messengers and the Inside messengers in such a short time is a godsend. Likewise, is the ability to do my upgrades and buying and selling without having to flip through a bunch of text scrolls.
And this is one thing that we're kind of missing while we're having our own conversation, Andrew, but a lot of stuff he just said, let me get to an actual
The
picture on
messengers
screen.
themselves went through many.
Yeah, so missing the fact sheep isn't here. He was pretty much like myself tuning into this. Yeah, I wonder if may have forgotten. I mean, it has been 2 weeks since the last stream, which I apologize for that, but I should have had that prepped better than I intended. But yeah, the things that he was saying about the messengers being conveniently next to each other to compare prices and everything, that is a bonus of having an actual hub, like a hardcore hub. You know, like this or Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 3, or the Round Table Hold. You know, it is nice to have all your vendors and sort of like selling points kind of next to each other, so you can kind of compare and contrast. That is a very nice aspect. A very nice aspect. That's a really underwhelming way to say. It's a very mechanically helpful way for you to compare things when the vendors are next to each other, and that is something that I will agree on. Bloodborne does that well by having the Hunter's Dream be a small area with lots of shit that, you know, it is a nice fact of the games that, they've gotten better with the hubs over time and making them sort of more efficient for what you need them to do. Must have missed the fact you can just click notify even if the times are wrong. Yeah, I'm still working to figure out how to fix the time thing. I have no idea why, because it's like the time that it registers the stream is wrong. The time that it registers when I like set up this stream is wrong, but I can't find the setting to change that. I don't know how to fix that. I'm trying to fix it, but we'll see what happens. If anything happens, I'll just put the stream on as a begin immediately or something like that, where it sends. I'll try to get it to send out notifications saying beginning in like however many minutes or whatever, so people can actually join up. But anyway, let's get back to what he's talking about with the messengers and stuff.
Through a bunch of text scrolls. The messengers themselves went through many iterations during development, so their exact nature cannot be ascertained by looking into the game, because the game has hints to more than one of the proposed origins for these guys still present. It is said that all great ones lose their young and yearn for surrogates, and this idea of children who failed to live might at one point have been embodied by the messengers.
Yeah, I'm still working on the time thing. I will try to work on it. I would like things to appear at the right time when I set them to be the right time. I don't know why it screws it up. I really don't know, but I'm working on it. I promise.
They are childlike, but they also have some physical deformities like cleft palates, uneven eyes, or cracked faces, just to name a few. They can also be seen in the crawler models from the Nightmare Frontier, and knowing that those guys are hearkening to Kos, that they are infested with messengers who are deformed children, might at one point have been a nod to how Kos's child was stillborn. With the emergence of the Red Moon, Gilbert succumbed to beasthood, and although I'm not playing every NPC story out, since he was so friendly in the beginning, I thought it'd be right to put him out of his misery.
This is one thing that's kind of underwhelming. And one thing that I was really adamant about doing in my Dark Souls 3 commentary. I'm about to cough. I'm so sorry. Anyway, one thing that he just mentioned about not doing all the NPC quest lines, that's very sort of a disservice to the game, especially when you're going to do like a analysis like this. Now, some games, I think you can cut some corners regarding that. But, you know, it was like, holy shit. It's like, come on. No. But like, you could at least do some quest lines. I mean, it's not that hard to do a lot of quest lines. I mean, like, I did it like pretty much all the quest lines for Dark Souls 3, you know, in my Dark Souls 3 commentary. And that whole video was, what, 6.5 hours? Like, it's not going to add that much time when you're already making a 7.5 hour video. You know, it's like you can put the time in to do it. I mean, it wouldn't be hard either. You could literally just take the wiki, doing the quest lines, get all the footage together, edit it all together, and then write the script for each individual quest line and just stick it at the end of the video. It's very easy to do. I do it differently than that, but you know, it could have worked.
That fight consisted of a single visceral attack, whereas the upcoming fight against the afflicted beggar will be a bit more. We sent the afflicted beggar to Erden Chapel so that he could kill the rude skeptical man. This area is littered with incense, a mechanic of the world which we sadly do not get to interact with at any point. Incense pushes beasts away as they don't like it, which is why the beggar is positioned outside. Whether that positioning was a lore decision, or whether the incense lore was written to make sense of his placement and that beasts don't come into Erden Chapel, a decision which was driven by the player needing the freedom to swing their weapons against enemies without killing other NPCs, I don't know. But I still think incense has some potential that isn't fully utilized. I don't know if I'd ever use an item which specifically makes me not have to fight enemies in a game about fighting enemies, but it doesn't take much imagination for good applications of this to start appearing. Dark Souls 3's Grand Archive area has the player dunk their head in wax to make themselves impervious to the curse attacks of the magical hands in that area. And I imagine that if Yharnam at the end would have been overrun by beasts, and I mean like beasts clamoring on beasts like cockroaches, it might have made sense for some optional questlines to have the player be given the choice to drench themselves in incense so that they can run through the city to finish the quest in one piece. It might be more hassle than it's worth to create such a mechanic, since it would need to shut an enemy's aggro state from triggering and would have to be allotted into the right enemies and finally be made interactable, so I understand on a technical level why we can't use incense. But since this exists in the world, logically one should expect that the hunter would want to get their hands on it. It might just have been a throwaway line to explain why enemies don't come to Erden Chapel, but I actually think no explanation would have played much better. Incense has the player ask questions, no answer just means that the player makes up their own. Like maybe the passive spirit of Erden repels enemies. This isn't a big deal or anything, but it's a chink in the armor, so I suppose it warranted discussing.
A chink in the armor that's worth discussing. You mean like ROM? One of the terrible fights required for game progression? Jeez.
Bloodborne, for the most part, is incredibly good at interweaving the world we play in and the game we play into one cohesive package.
We're about to finish up Eileen's questline, and fun fact, the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst tied Ludwig as the enemy who killed me the most in the entire game with a total of 6 deaths. I decided I'd try a different tactic for each encounter, which I'll show off as I go against him. But first, Eileen. Eileen is a rare NPC in that her questline does not end with her explicitly dying. She's an old hunter from a faraway land, and she was once connected to the dream like we are now. What exactly becomes of her after she hands the duty of hunting hunters to us is not known, but it might be something as simple as her just hanging up the mask and going on with the rest of her life. That mask has incense inside of it to mask the scent of blood, and plague doctors in the real world wore those sorts of beak masks for the same reason. The scent of death is disgusting, but in the lore of Bloodborne, it might also be that Eileen did this because the scent of blood might be a trigger towards blood drunkenness, and masking it, along with shielding exposure to all of her body parts, made her that extra bit safe. Before the DLC, the assumption some players had was that the Bloody Crow of Canehurst was the apprentice of Gurman, rather than, Maria, which it is now. The idea was that since the Crow uses the art of quickening a lot by activating the old hunter's bone, there was a link between them and the grave near the abandoned old workshop. Additionally, since the doll sometimes tends that grave, the idea was that the apprentice was the one who built the doll, and since the doll is wearing Canehurstian attire, she was drawn to this guy who wears Canehurstian armor. And the idea was that he built her rather than Gurman, and he did so in the likeness of Queen Annalise.
I like how that entire fight he was just wasting bullets. He's like, I'm going to use different strategies against this enemy. This is the I'm going to waste bullets strategy.
Of course, that doesn't quite work because, as you can plainly see, this guy is alive and not buried outside the abandoned old workshop for me to have looted a bone of his corpse. What makes this fight hard is that the punishment for failure is very steep, as the Crow of Canehurst NPC can take me down in 2 or so hits. And since he has such a high blood tinge, he does really good with his pistol without even having to use bone marrow ash. Blood tinge is the stat which governs firearm scaling, but it also has attunement with certain weapons, 2 of whom connect with Canehurst, the Rider Palash and the Chikake. The idea with blood tinge weapons is that they either have a secondary firearm function like Simon's Bowblade, the Saw Rifle, and the Rider Palashk, or that they cost blood to use like the Chikage and the Bloodletter. The Crow of Canehurst uses the Chikage, and the idea with it is that once transformed, it gains the ability to poison the enemy, but also passively drains some of its wielder's health every second. To counter this, the Bloody Crow of Canehurst has the ability to use blood vials. I've only ever seen him use 1 per fight, but apparently he has been seen using 2. And to put pressure on the player to not try to have the Crow die of his own health drain, this guy has the good sense to deactivate his weapons from time to time. He can also throw Numbing Mist, which is an item from Canehurst, which prevents healing, and finally, he's very good at interrupting your attacks, and since he's as strong as he is, his visceral attacks are usually game over. For this fight, I tried using poisoned knives to kill him, I tried using blue elixirs to sneak my way towards him, and I tried to use my own quickening to match his aggression, but ultimately, the only tactic which worked for me was to go back to basics and interrupt as many of his attacks as I could for some of that sweet visceral attack damage. Now that he's dead, I can relieve Eileen of her post as the Hunter of Hunters and get what I consider to be the best oath rune in the Hunter's rune. This thing increases the speed at which stamina regenerates by 6%. That might not seem like much, but it really is. The oath runes in the base game are Impurity, which we got from Walter, which gives a 2% health increase during co-op. Corruption, which I'll get from Annalise later, which gives a continuous heal effect of +1 near death. Radiance, which we get at the end of Alfred's questline, which increases the amount of health each individual vial will heal us by, and Hunter, which is the one I'll be going with for the time being. Out of these 4, only Radiance and Hunter are actually good, and considering stamina is regenerated passively and serves a function for healing via the rally mechanic, I consider Hunter to be better than Radiance. There are very few times where I would have really wanted to have had more health, but very often do I find myself wanting to have that little bit extra stamina. There are many times where I'm just about to finish an encounter, but find myself getting fatigued and unable to get the job done. Times where I know that if I had just lasted a bit longer, if I had just been able to gather up some extra amounts of energy, I would have performed much better. But there are also times playing Bloodborne where I want faster stamina regeneration. A few minutes ago, I said that Yahar Ghul might not be everyone's favorite area, and I want to return to that point a bit. If you map it out, this is among the most impressive levels in the game in terms of sheer size, enemy placement, integrated environmental challenge, and visual design. Though, that is subjective. But there's a catch attached to this place, which is that it has arguably the worst enemy design once you consider the core gameplay. Now, I'm going to refute that argument a bit because I think it's needlessly harsh, but first I'll just go over it. Early enemies here respawn if you don't kill the Bell Maidens, so in each encounter, the player's optimal strategy is to ignore enemies and go for the Bell Maidens first. The issue there is that once the enemies have been skipped, to fight them usually means you need to run backwards. And if you don't want to do that at that point anyways, maybe you can also stomach not going for the Bell Maiden in the first place. So instead of doing the challenge as you're supposed to, you just wind up running through the area. Additionally, since there's no convenient shortcut to the boss once you've gotten to the level's end once, you're probably just gonna rush it if you die. And finally, on the streets leading to the One Reborn, we have enemies who can attack from a distance, who deal massive damage, and who like to attack in groups. The worst solution to a Souls area lacking difficulty is to crank up the damage values and increase the threshold for enemies being stunned. That much I can get behind, but that isn't what is actually being done here. I disagree with so much of the assessment of Yahar Ghul being a poorly designed area because I think, although it is cranking up the values and incentivizing the player to run through, this place still has craft which warrants noting. For one, attaching the numeric value increases of the enemies to the Bell Maidens, I think is a brilliant touch. It forces players to assess combat a bit differently and leans into Bloodborne's ability to have placement be more proactive than in Souls.
Have placement be more proactive than in Souls? What, you mean like in other games where you run around slashing and hacking? Kind of like the other Souls games? It's like, come on. That's Bloodborne didn't invent running around and killing enemies. Okay, like this. Let's get the point. Let's get the point again.
Numeric value increases of the enemies to the Bell Maidens, I think is a brilliant touch. It forces players to assess combat a bit differently and leans into Bloodborne's ability to have placement be more proactive than in Souls.
What, you mean like when you're going to when you go to heading towards Nito and you go through the skeleton area with all the dudes that reassemble the skeletons? A very, very similar encounter to what you have in Yahar Ghul. Man, it's almost like Dark Souls didn't know what it was doing when it did it. Man, really makes you think.
In Souls, once you got fighting an enemy, you needed to be the one on the move to optimize your footing. If a large enemy were to do a big attack, you would want to roll out of its way rather than block to conserve some stamina. But before counterattacking, it would have been fruitful in Souls to first make sure that your new position provided you with enough options in case you needed to roll again shortly. In this sense, enemies very much set the rules of combat, since you would figure out your optimal placement by observing their behaviors and estimating your best options from there. In Bloodborne, you have so much added mobility that you can, for the most part, reposition yourself anywhere on the map when fighting an enemy. So when you decide on an engagement, the enemy is following you, rather than the other way around. And the Bell Maidens capitalize on this. This area, with the choir member corps holding the key to Upper Cathedral Ward, is a good example. If you're really greedy, you can fight the buffed Huntsman's minions, but the Bell Maiden was positioned upstairs where I needed to roll off a cliff to meet her. At this point in the level, players should be familiar enough with the respawning enemy gimmick that they know brute forcing their way through here isn't the optimal strategy, and since the room with the Upper Cathedral Ward key is in the center of the area, and since the loot glowing from the key on the corpse highlights it, players are asked to think a bit before venturing on. As for the more open areas, the Bell Maidens are a pretty clever inclusion as well. The Yarnamites are not fast enough to pursue you if you bolt to the Bell Maidens, so their placement ahead of them isn't really meant to be a combat encounter, but rather an obstacle course which tests your timing and precision. Going backwards to kill them after making them weak is then just a way to collect some easy blood echoes as your reward. And the respawning enemies, which all urge you to play fast, are doing so for a reason. Running makes you miss details until it's too late. Like how there's an amygdala, which can fire a laser at you. The path of the laser isn't straight, and the laser's lingering trail in the ground blows up on a delay, so there's a little developer assistance to ensure that the player can have a safe spot on the stairs if they're observant enough. A big part of the Yahar Ghul Hypogean jail map was made available for players to explore after they got kidnapped by the Snatcher earlier, and the new enemies and scenery will make players appreciate just how drastic the happenings of the Menses ritual are, since when they arrive to the street leading to the Advent Plaza, they'll have proper context for how that area was supposed to look. The cell area we awoke in when the Snatcher kidnapped us earlier was called Hypogean Jail. G-A-O-L is an old-timey way of spelling jail, and Hypogean means underground, so that area was literally the underground jail where the kidnapped Yarnamites were held. The game does not go into explicit detail on the ritual, but we know some stuff. It was fueled by bodies and probably necromancy, and an ominous choir singing came from the Advent Plaza. This is the area where we could teleport from Yahar Ghul to the Hunter's Dream earlier, but the lantern has been broken now, assumably by the ritual hunters. There are 3 hostile NPCs in this area who assumably broke the lantern to make sure that no one could interfere with the Menses ritual. And while I deal with them, I'm going to talk a bit about Menses. The school of Menses is an offshoot of Birkenworth, controlled by Mikolash, and they seek to gain an audience with the Great Ones. Although they are not the main villains of the game, they are the final threat we come to face, and it is ultimately them who bring the, admittedly, decimated corpse of the city to its knees. The damage done by the Healing Church was almost certainly unrepairable, but once Menses is done, the city is done. Well, in lore at least. The latter half of the game has an iffier convergence of the game on screen and the story it's telling than the beginning had, thanks to the changes to how maps work. The Red Moon used to work similar to how the Insight mechanic used to work, like Demon Souls' World Tendency. The Red Moon would trigger a global variable which every level would check before being built by the game, and once true, each level would know to change the skybox to incorporate the Red Moon, change the lighting from the game's usual to red, and would swap out every human enemy for beasts, and every beast enemy for larger beasts. I wonder if the false sun in Dark Souls' On Orlando used to be a much more pronounced feature at some point, which got scaled back, and From was attempting with the Red Moon to reintegrate that idea here. Our old nemesis, last-minute change from dynamic maps to static ones, is why the red moon is a bit underwhelming under the microscope, but the visual splendor of getting to this place and seeing all the horrifying happenings is still a really good moment, I think. Since we're able to see this area before the red moon came, we have a frame of reference for just how insane everything is. And since the game doesn't really incentivize the player to return to old areas, they probably won't figure to check whether the red moon is now omnipresent like it's supposed to be in the story, which, like I said earlier, it isn't. While we've been running around killing bosses, in the background, there's been a turf war brewing between the game's separated factions. I noted earlier that the key to Upper Cathedral Ward was found on the corpse of a choir member, which seems to indicate that Mensis has some plans to assault them. Well, had some plans to assault them before the ritual fried their brains and mummified their bodies. Mensis controls the unseen village, and they are the ones who sent the Thumerian snatchers around to kidnap Yarnamites. While the Healing Church tried to kidnap Yarnamites.
Drop 20 bullets.
While the Healing Church tried to use blood transfusions to elevate humanity to the next stage of being, which caused Yarnam's downfall and the church to lose its power, and the choir tried using their connection to Ebrietas and the lost land of East to research the cosmos, and instead of blood transfusions tried to ascend by creating kin, and where Master Willem seems to have gone a bit loony, trying to elevate his thoughts to ascend, Mensis' approach has been guided by their discovery of Lauren and their connection to the amygdala, as is evident by the statues Mensis built of the amygdalas in the unseen village. They intend to have an audience with the Great One as a means of ascension, and specifically, they intended to use the third umbilical cord belonging to Murgo, the child of the old Thumerian Queen Yarnam, as the medium to facilitate the meeting with Kos, who would make this happen for them. Later on, Mikolash will ask Kos to line his brains with eyes. He did not have the 3 cords needed for ascension, so it seems he was unaware of that stipulation. Rather, he seems to think Ram's vacuousness occurred because Ram was not enlightened enough as a human. In this sense, Mikolash is not too far from Willem, but instead of meditation, Mikolash just reaches out to a Great One and asks it to give him the insight, which will let him ascend. The name Mensis comes from Latin, where it means month, and it is usually used in the context of menstruation.
The lunar cycle is roughly a month in length, and considering the heavy matriarchal themes of the game, you might think there's something to the idea of
Mensis trying to use a red moon to gain audience. There was a note left in Bergenworth which went, "When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the Great Ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child." And this note is an example of bad translation, because it should go more like, when the red moon draws near, the boundary for man becomes vague, and the Great Ones appear. And then we bear our children. And the 2 things the translation got wrong here was the meaning of bearing our children and the meaning of the boundary for man becoming vague. When the Japanese text says bear our children, it doesn't mean this is when ladies get pregnant. It means this is the time we hand our children off to the Great Ones. Ariana's pregnancy coinciding with this event is probably just a coincidence, as the game establishes that Erden had been writhing around inside of her even before the red moon. Editor's note: it was writing this part of the script where it finally clicked for me where the messengers we encounter come from. Mass child sacrifice. Enjoy! And that part about the boundary for man becoming vague does not mean that the red moon is when Bergenworth believes men become beasts, but rather that it is when men's limitations are removed, and they can elevate their thoughts. The Bergenworth adage, "We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood," in Japanese reads more like, "The blood is what makes us human no more." And the idea there seems to be that Thumerians might originally have been beasts which were fed blood to transform them into Thumerians to serve the Great Ones in the Chalice dungeons. Old blood makes people moldable, and maybe the Great Ones guided the transition from beast to Thumerian. And that using the old blood now without any celestial guidance is reverting people back to their true beastly form. The reason for the mental collapse during the Red Moon is because it's kind of like the old blood, except for the mind. The old blood makes the body moldable, the Red Moon does the same for the mind. If the old blood is a formula in an injection, the Red Moon is like a formula injected with rays. The appearance of the Red Moon signals the arrival of the Great Ones. This is why Menzies sought to bring it about, as this is when the Great Ones turn up for them to be communicated with. Knowing as much and wanting to reconnect with Mikolash, who has been stuck in the nightmare for some time, Menzies conducts their ritual, and upon connecting with Murgo, their brains are fried. Many of the Menzies corpses we will find leading up to Mikolash will be shackled, indicating that this ritual wasn't necessarily something everyone agreed to embark on. Regardless, it went through, and the petrified corpses of the Yarnamites in this area are a testament to the powers which Menzies unleashed.
A lot of my time in Yahar Ghul will be spent fighting, so I'm gonna talk a bit about the enemies here. Specifically, I wanna talk about the cramped caskets. These things are
Wonderfully designed in that, in spite of their immense size and placement as late-game enemies, they aren't hit sponges. They are very easy to stunlock, but they make up for it with a large health pool, which is easy to drain your stamina trying to empty. They deal a respectable amount of damage and can lock the hunter up if the players are careless enough in fighting them. Also, they take damage from the burning corpses in the area, so you can always just try to abuse that if these guys are giving you too hard of a time. In the early game, there were a lot of coffins and caskets strewn around Yharnam, which had been chained shut, and it's entirely possible that these things, in lore terms at least, emerged out of those caskets, seeing as they are attached to caskets on the bottom. You can find these enemies in Chalice dungeons where they don't have the caskets, so it's possible Menzies dug them up from there, locked them up, and distributed them throughout Yharnam in case they ever needed a scorched earth approach to war in a specific region. Their internal name is Mimic, so maybe the original idea was even that the player would open chests and caskets, and these things would come out of them like the mimics in Dark Souls. The streets of the Unseen City are very wide, and zigzagging is enough to deal with the range attacks from the cramped caskets, so they are skippable, but since they drop some respectable blood gems, it might be worth the blood vial investment to take these guys out. Although the balancing and math under the hood are a bit complex, the theory underpinning player progression in these games is very simple, as is the reason players tend to stay within the expected level range of a given area. Players have natural defenses tied to their levels as well as strengths. Players upgrade their levels to see those numbers go up. Simple enough. The balancing is something FromSoft probably figures out from playtesting, but they are assisted in that players are more interested in progressing than they are in over-leveling themselves. Yahar Ghul is a good enough source of blood echoes that theoretically I could stick around this area and grind out as many levels as I need to become vastly overpowered for the game to come. If I put this into a formula, I could even reason that this would be a wiser strategy than going to the next area, since the added levels will go some ways to keep me safe in them. Grinding is a pretty smart insurance policy. But players don't do it unless they are really struggling with an area, because grinding is not as engaging as going through the next area would be. And this little quirk of player psychology goes a long way to keep the game's challenge somewhat balanced all throughout. If you're over leveled in an area, you have no reason to grind, so over a playthrough, the game's rising difficulty will likely catch up with you. If you're at the right level, you'll probably retry the current area rather than go back to grind. Only when you are underleveled is grinding Blood Echoes a more appealing option than venturing forwards. Bloodborne does not utilize any dynamic difficulty scaling, like making enemy levels rubber band near the players to ensure that the challenge is maintained all throughout. This makes Bloodborne a more easily digestible game in replay terms, since you'll have a pretty good idea of what each build will be able to dish out in an area, but there is still something to be considered here. The optimal path through the game and the optimal path to a certain build are not the same thing. And since the game emphasizes progressing through the game rather than through your builds, unnecessary difficulty spikes are going to crop up simply because players opted in and out of the most optimal choices to reap rewards later. What I'm saying is, since the game front-loads certain weapons and since it does not dynamically adjust itself to the players, Bloodborne is not as good of a game for every build. Demon Souls and Dark Souls had major balancing issues for their magic classes, but the players still had those classes accessible from the beginning. If the restrictive early game in Bloodborne was a way to rectify the need to balance builds to better match the game's difficulty spike, that is, overpowered strategies are not as front-loaded as they were in Souls, then I think Bloodborne hits the dragon to the wrong horse. Since we can directly compare Souls and Bloodborne, I'm a much bigger fan of optimizing the game around builds than optimizing the builds to map on to the game. If that means certain early game builds are going to be able to coast for some time, then so be it. I'd rather Bloodborne gave me an overpowered arcane build against the Bloodstarved Beast way back when than an underwhelming arcane build against the Bloodstarved Beast. And yes, I know that experimental enough players have found a way for every build to be somehow viable from the start, but those examples actually prove my point rather than refute it. If you are familiar enough with the nitty-gritty of the game, you can fetch yourself the right weapons, items, and buffs, and be overpowered in no time. The problem with the idea that this is a solution to, compared to Souls, limited early game build variety is that those strategies are reserved for players deeply familiar enough with the game, and those strategies also break the game's difficulty curve without offering the average player access to more builds. So if the restriction on build variety was placed to ensure a smoother difficulty curve, it didn't even accomplish that. Note that in my example of arcane build versus Bloodstarved Beast, I didn't say I wanted an overpowered arcane build rather than an underpowered one. I said overpowered rather than underwhelming. Magic and pyromancy builds in Dark Souls 1 were not fun because they made the player overpowered. They were fun because they shook up the playstyle and asked players to see the game from a new point of view. Those builds delivered to the player an experience rather than a good difficulty curve. And I think this approach to looking at these games goes a long way to explain what can be so magical about them. I don't want this video to be too tempered in negativity, but I think it's important to include in the Bloodborne conversation not just what we liked about the game, but also which elements we think could have been better.
Like ROM. Oh, man. It still boggles my mind that he's bringing up all these points of we need to talk about the good and the bad, and then he just lightly skirts over how bad ROM is. It's such an annoying thing.
That's a subjective conversation, of course, so it's going to fall on Miyazaki to decide what is and what is not good feedback. I'm not entirely sure many people saying the same thing means the feedback is good, especially since we might not necessarily be attracted to the game for the same reasons. So I'm gonna leave it up to you to decide for yourself if we like the game for the same reasons. Bear in mind that I don't think you liking it differently from me in any way diminishes your appreciation of it. You're allowed to like the Bloodborne you play, just as I'm allowed to like the Bloodborne I play. The boss of this area is the One Reborn, and surprise, surprise, it's one I consider to be a total knockout. It borrows the boss room layout from the Tower Knight fight from Demon Souls, what with projectile enemies being stationed above and the stairs to set projectile enemies being located in the far left and far right behind the boss. Seeing the Bell Maidens in the cutscene prior to the boss also pays off the preceding areas, since we know these gals like to add an additional challenge to the enemies we're fighting.
Meaning the Bell Maidens in the Unseen Village were a tutorial for the boss, which is another reason to like them.
This boss leans into the player's improved mobility from Souls, has interesting hitboxes, has what I consider to be a good boss arena. I've laid out my standards for what I consider to be the hallmarks of a good boss fight in these games already. My affinity for this guy should not be a surprise. The internal ID name for the One Reborn is Half-Baked Devil, which might give some indication to this thing's function. Many of the ID names are carryovers from old builds, so we can't reliably use them for lore, but the idea of this thing being half-baked indicates that it is an incomplete devil. Whether that means the Menses ritual was trying to construct an artificial great one by maybe using the craft they honed making craft caskets, or their knowledge of the Bell Maiden's summons is unclear, as is much of this boss. Considering Menses' obsession with cause, it might be that this was an attempt to resurrect it so that they could have the audience they wanted. But that's purely speculation. In the end, it might be that the One Reborn is just a massive goop of bodies reanimated with necromancy. Now that
All right, with that, I'm gonna have to go. But my thoughts on the One Reborn. It's basically Tower Knight with an extra fleshy, flappy, spazzy moveset. So I'd say it's a step down from Tower Knight. But yeah, we have made it past the halfway point. We are getting there. This stream was kind of nice to be able to make some serious progress. I think we actually made like a full hour through this thing, which is nice because I'm ready to move past this fucking video. I'm tired of watching it. I'm also tired of having him make the same points sort of over and over that we've refuted in previous streams. But this is going to be the end of this stream. We're going to be doing this next week. So look forward to that. Or at least I hope you look forward to that. But I'd just like to thank you all for watching. I will see you guys later.